Hi, my name is Amari, and I wanted to talk to you guys about the topic that I chose to write about over the course of the semester. So, the topic that I chose is the racial disparity in the criminal justice system. And the political cartoon that you guys are looking at now was illustrated by Jimmy Margulies back in 2014. And back in 2014 is when we saw the rise of movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, and we started seeing more media attention to African Americans being killed by police. So, I just kind of wanted to set the tone and kind of give you guys something to think about why I start talking a little bit more about the racial disparity in the criminal justice system. So, before we get more into causes and solutions and different things that contributed to the racial disparity, I want to talk to you guys about the definition of the racial disparity. So, Dennis Schwartz and Jerry McElroy, who both work with the Sentencing Project, that I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about later, actually released a journal article in 2000. And in this article that they titled Reducing the Racial Disparity in the Criminal Justice System, they define racial disparity as the proportion of a racial or ethnic group within the control of a system being greater than the proportion of such groups in the general population. And so basically, what that means pertaining to African Americans specifically was kind of backed up by Drew Cran's article, and who Drew Cran is an associate producer over at CNN. And in July, he wrote the article titled Five Facts Behind America's Highest Incarceration Rates. And in that, he discussed the findings of the Bureau of Justice Statistics 2018 report. And that report shows that African Americans represent 12% of the U.S. population, but they actually represent 33% of the federal and state prison populations. So that kind of gives you a background to put with the definition of racial disparity. So the Sentencing Project, who is actually a nonprofit organization who work to promote sentencing policies and they address racial disparities and practices within the criminal justice system, submitted a report back in April of this year to the United Nations. And in that report, they actually discussed the findings that African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once they're arrested, they're more likely to be convicted, and once they're convicted, they're more likely to serve longer sentences than their white counterparts. And so the infographic that you guys are looking at now actually shows that on average, 1 in 9 men will be incarcerated during their lifetime. For African American, that's 1 in 3, and versus white Americans, who's 1 in 17. And so I know initially when we look at these statistics, it's very easy for us to say, well, obviously African Americans commit crimes at higher rates. And so what I want to kind of I want us to back up a little bit because everything's not so cut and dry, and this is one of those issues. So the criminal justice system initially started to see a racial disparity back when President Nixon was president. So, in an article titled A Brief History of the Drug War that was published in 2016 by a coalition of individuals working to reform policies that were introduced in the war on drugs called We Are a Drug Policy Alliance, actually discussed that John Ehrlichman, who is was a top aide in Nixon's White House and as well as on his campaign, actually came out and said that when Nixon was president, the two enemies that he saw were the anti-war left and black people. So what he did was obviously he couldn't make it illegal to be black, or he couldn't make it legal to hate black people or people who were against the war. So instead what he did is he created associations. And Ehrlichman went on to explain that by creating these associations of hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin and crack cocaine, he was able to disrupt those communities. And how he was able to disrupt those communities is he was able to go in and arrest their leaders, he was able to raid their homes, and he was able to break up their meetings, further disrupting the social order. And then he was able to actually see them be defiled on nightly news, which continued to affect people. And so what happens is we have to take a second to realize that that's only 50 years ago. So there's police officers that were serving during then. There's police officers that have trained other police officers that are serving now. And so with that being ingrained into their training, it creates these stereotypes and it creates these biases that continue to affect African Americans and the African American community today. So speaking specifically about the war on drugs, crack cocaine is still a big factor. So two of the main things that were implemented were one, mandatory sentencing for drug crimes, and two would be no-knock warrants. So basically, anybody from law enforcement, if there was a suspicion that there would be or could be drugs inside somebody's house, then they could walk in and they could arrest and search and seize whatever they found. And so Alexander Rudolph's peer review article that was actually released back in 1997 titled Differential Punishing of African Americans and Whites Who Possess Drugs, a chess policy or a continuation of the past, provides further insight into the strategic criminalization of these drugs. So as it currently stands, African Americans typically use the drug crack cocaine, and white people typically use the drug cocaine. So essentially, these are actually the same drugs. They're just used in different ways. And so, right as it stands, and this is still current, like it was implemented back in 1971. So, to possess 3 grams of crack cocaine is punishable by up to 20 years in prison, and that's 3 grams of crack cocaine. And then for 10 grams of cocaine powder, which is typically possessed by white people and the white counterparts, that's only punishable up to 5 years in prison. And medical studies that have been done on crack cocaine and cocaine have shown that they are just as damaging and volatile to communities and individuals. So it kind of makes you wonder why there's such a disparity as far as the minimum sentences. And so I wanted to show you guys this infographic that kind of shows the rates that African Americans and whites use drugs. So this is based on a 2011 study that was done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And so you can see that for the most part, African Americans and whites actually commit drugs at very, very similar rates, with there being only small disparities. And so I'm going to give you guys a second to look at that. All right, and so this next slide that I want to show you guys, so this shows the arrest rates for drugs. And it becomes very evident that though we just saw that African Americans and whites use drugs at similar rates, there's a very, very large disparity in arrest rates. And so I want to kind of talk about a little bit more of why that is. So the biggest factor that we see is racial disparity. Is implicit biases leading to racial disparity. So what implicit biases are essentially biases that we aren't aware that we possess affecting our decisions. And so everybody possesses implicit biases. We get them from our parents, we get them from the media, and the things that we see and know as we grow up and every day. And so this becomes dangerous when implicit biases play a role in decisions that affect somebody's future, such as if you're in the position of a judge or a prosecutor or somebody on the jury. So it's very important for us to begin to recognize the implicit biases that we possess. So I think the biggest thing that I would recommend for us kind of recognizing the implicit biases and kind of changing the direction that we're going regarding the racial disparity in the criminal justice system is, first and foremost, take a look at the way that we perceive people and the things around us, and give ourselves and the other people chances to get acquainted and to know each other. And next, I would recommend equality of education. So if everybody's able to get into equal education and everybody's able to have the opportunity to have access to the same resources, then we'll see a little bit less of the disparity. It's just because the disparity often comes from having to fight for more resources. And so the last thing that I wanted to kind of leave you guys with was basically my call to action. So reach out to your representatives. I know Oklahoma recently just decreased minimum sentences for previous drug crimes. So we want to reach out to our representatives and continue that if you live in states such as Texas or Colorado or anywhere else. And then we want to promote alternatives to incarceration, such as rehabilitation services, mental health services. And then the biggest thing is not staying complacent in something as big as this. So we really, really want to work together to kind of fight for those communities and fight for people who aren't educated enough to fight for themselves. So I hope I gave you guys something to think about, and just let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.